So we're going to look at following up last class's study in the Elizabethan world picture and just framework of the ideas of the time. I thought we would begin with a look at Sir Francis Bacon's essays as my very brief and only excursion into prose for the 17th century. In general, I'm going to be looking at poetry because I only have a semester and I really would struggle to be more comprehensive if I try to do everything the 17th century does. And you're going to see that that's particularly because of the richness and diversity of the 17th century as a period, which I'm not going to reflect in the teaching of this course for the sake of coherence. I simply just can't do it. I am going to focus on certain things of the greatest interest and of the greatest longevity for that matter. So as I said last time, I'm looking at the great writers of the period, not every writer who deserves treatment in this class, but the greatest writers of all of them, and Bacon is certainly one of them. And through Bacon, I wanted to introduce a common theme of the 17th century, which is not only of the 17th century, and that is of its humanism. So I want to say a few words about the humanism of the period and what that actually means, because the word humanism, used as such with that suffix ism, is first coined in the 19th century. And it has a wide range of potential meanings in Christian circles. To be a humanist is to be opposed to Christian worldview. You know, that's often the pejorative term with which it's used. That's not the sense of humanists, the Christian humanists that arise in the period concerned. Those humanists arise in the 14th century with Francesco Petrarch as an anti-Aristotelian group, more or less. So the Italian Renaissance begins with Francesco Petrarch, our friend Dante being one of them, and it's a movement and it's a attempted recovery of the classical period and everything it meant. So now it means a force of thought that displaces God, puts man in the center of life. That's 19th century humanism. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about here. So the humanists of this period needs to be used more precisely. And as I say, the humanism is not a term that they even use, but they will call themselves humanists, and they get that word from the Italian word umanista, without the H, humanista, otherwise you could spell it, which just is a teacher, and is deriving from Cicero's use of the word humanitas. And this is a very important point for me because I see myself as a humanities professor in this tradition. So the word humanitas needs a little bit of expansion. If you're studying literature, you're studying one of the humanities, and probably the one that is most useful for the study of humanities, literature, because literature encompasses the field of rhetoric, which is the crown of the humanities in many ways. And this word humanitas, the Latin word, has two meanings, and twofold really. The first is of mankind itself, humanity, in its general sense. We use this word to this day in English. You know, rather than the old biblical God and man, we prefer to avoid the word man because it sounds too gendered, and so we use the word humanity as a replacement, even though man in the biblical sense is referring to humanity, but we'll just use the one as a synonym for the other. So it has that sense. So Cicero's word humanitas has the sense of mankind in general. But secondly, and this is the important point in some way, it's a translation of the Greek word paideia. So humanitas, one is the human race, or or what we can call man. And 2, a reference to this word paideia. And the word paideia is an extraordinarily important concept here. Paideia is a culture or liberal education which fully develops this. So it is the means by which this becomes most fully this. As we know, animals don't have to educate their children. There is no course of learning. There's no curriculum, right? It's not that they don't instruct. They show, older birds teach the younger birds how to fly by doing it by example. They follow the example, etc., as they grow, etc. But there is no sense that the small bird is becoming anything other than it already is. It develops feathers. It develops the strength of the wings, its wingspan. All that comes naturally, as it were, but it doesn't expand. It can't become something other than what it is. Either it can fly or it can't. But there are different ways of flying that birds teach themselves. They do act in accordance with their inbuilt capacities. Whereas humanity, in the sense of paideia, is developing us in the sense of what is essential to human nature, which then begs the question of what is human nature. And for the humanists of the Italian Renaissance and the English Renaissance, for that matter, this will have a theological answer. Because we're made in the image of God. And this very word paideia is used in Ephesians 6, verse 4. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. The word fear there is actually paideia. Terrible translation. It's a reference to one of the methods of a pedagogue in the ancient world, which is to use fear to encourage the pupils to study. But it's incidental. It's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to make a child a creature in God's image, which he already is. The potential for humanity is there. The child is fully human already in the sense of his status before God. But he becomes more himself through paideia, right? And so that is the sense of humanitas, which is so much a part of the Elizabethan world that we looked at last time. So Renaissance humanism is primarily an educational movement which begins in Italy in the early 14th century and reaches England at the end of the 15th century. And by the time we get to the 16th, it's full-blown. Full-blown in the form of the Elizabethans and so forth. And Shakespeare is one of the great products of that, but so will Mr. Milton be at the end of the 17th century period that we're going to look at. And the humanist was a classical scholar then, who with 2 complementary aims. 2, and they're complementary. One is to recover the moral values of classical life. Not all the moral values are going to be colored by Christian conviction, but the so-called the virtues. Recovery of the classical virtues. And secondly, to imitate the language and the style of the classics as a means to the first end. So one, recover the moral character of the ancient world, which they admired so greatly. And secondly, to create a patterning and imitation of the texts that formed the human race in that age. Now, in one sense, you could see it leaning against Christianity, because it's trying to recover the past. It's not trying to recover a fully Christian sense of humanity, but and I think that's there in the Italian Renaissance. There definitely is a reaction and maybe even a return to a sort of a paganism in the Italian Renaissance. You can see that, although in the art of the period, and you can see it particularly in the Borgias and the famous decadence of the Italian Renaissance city-states, very much vainglorious and predatory and extraordinarily vivid period. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be that way, and for Christians it isn't. So the same spirit of the humanists, and Erasmus is probably the great humanist of his day, what they share in common, interestingly, is a hatred for Aristotle. Not Aristotle per se, but Aristotle as a finished book on the development of human nature. So in other words, the very thing that I spoke of last time, the medieval synthesis of Aristotelian thought with Christianity, that fusion was questioned during the medieval period in the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is using the classics against Aristotle, which is an interesting thing. So the rest of the classics against Aristotle as the only representative of the classics. So it's a broader sense of the medieval synthesis. And if you want a reflection of that, then read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, where he does provide a version of the medieval synthesis, but he's citing way more than Aristotle. He will refer to all manner of historical influences. And the chief of those that we're going to look at today for Mr. Bacon is the great Roman orator Cicero. In Latin you call him Cicero, but we call him Cicero. And Cicero is the hero of the humanists for a variety of reasons. One, because he is a politician and an orator and a moralist. So he combines the two things that the Renaissance humanist most deeply prizes, which is the combination of action and contemplation, the perfect match of those two things. Not just contemplation, but action. He's a man of action. He's a man of politics, as well as being the second Plato. He writes the Republic in Latin, following Plato's style. Secondly, his literary style becomes a model for the humanists as the embodiment of eloquence. And that's enough said about that. But I needed to say that as a prelude to looking at Bacon, because Bacon, like most of the prose stylists of this period, is most profoundly influenced by Cicero. And I wanted to talk, when I'm coming to Bacon's essay, about the style, not just the substance. It's a very important consideration for us, and one I need to draw attention to, because the style of Cicero and the way in which he writes prose is so very different than the way we're all taught to write prose. It's very different, and you would have recognized that right away when you started reading Bacon's essays, how different it is. And I'm going to try and trace for you the primary feature of the style that Bacon uses and note some of the features of that style, and something that I think we can replicate, quite frankly. But it's very different than our modern style. Let me make a first comment about the word that he chooses to describe and to describe this prose form that he uses, namely the essay. The essay is very familiar to every student because essays are what you're asked to write in school and in university. But it is a very modern form of writing. So despite this being the Renaissance and the recovery of ancient learning, the form in which Bacon writes is not an ancient form. And in that sense, Bacon is not really a Ciceronian and probably not really a humanist in that particular sense. He's very much of a new man. But that doesn't mean that he abandons Ciceronian style. I think he's most prominently influenced by Cicero in his style. So I'm going to maintain that he is, roughly speaking, Ciceronian for the sake of argument. I think if I had experts in the room, we would then have a huge discussion over whether he's a Ciceronian or not, and they would be correct in saying that he really isn't. There's many new things about Mr. Bacon. But the common features I'm going to show you. But the essay as a literary form owes its origin to another contemporary of Bacon's. It's not Bacon's invention. It's a man by the name of Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne. And as the French verb essayer suggests, these are trials. To essay something in English is to try something new. In other words, a thought experiment, if you will. Let me just try this idea. It's the mode of instruction that we have landed upon in universities for quite a while now. And effectively, that's what you're being asked to do when you're being asked to write an essay. There's a prompt that you'll be given that you'll respond to, and you're trying out an idea. That's what you're doing when you're writing an essay. And you are to have a certain structure, you're to have an argument, you're making a certain case, but really you're experimenting with an idea. That's what you're doing in an essay. You're thinking for yourself. And that's why we use it in university. We want you to be thinking about this. On the other hand, we want you to model an awareness of what came before you. So it's not just the thoughts that come to you, from your self-examination, your internalization of the process. You're to think about the text that you've just read, and you're to engage with that. And the text you've just read may have cited, and probably on my course certainly, will have cited all sorts of foregoing authors. And you're supposed to have engaged with them as well. So your essay, your thought experiment, isn't an experiment from nothing. It's an experiment engaging with the thought of another, but it's trying to present a thesis about how to understand that author the best. But that's what an essay is. And Bacon, when he writes these then, is writing a very novel form of literature. And the chief distinguishing mark of the style, this is what I want to say here first, is called a period. A period. Now, I have to bring that, I keep pushing that away, I keep having to bring it back. Period down here, where is this? Do I have an eraser? I used to erase it with my jacket, and my wife was appalled, so understandably. A period. In North American discourse, a period is a full stop. Period. Say in Britain, they call it a full stop. What I'm talking about has nothing to do with the punctuation mark. A period is not a matter of punctuation, it's a matter of style. And what Bacon is presenting in his essays is that form of style which we will call a period. It's not a sentence. It's not a paragraph. We construct our thoughts in sentences and paragraphs. You've been taught that, the figures of parts of speech. You have to write in full sentences, you're told. Right? You have to have a subject, you have to have a verb, and at the very least, those two things, and probably an object. Your aim is to be clear and to the point, right? That's what you're taught in sentences. Your utmost aim is clarity. And getting to the point right away is something we highly prize, and so we don't tend to favor long sentences either. Relatively brief, punctuated prose is the aim. And anything that goes on longer, well, you've probably got run-on sentences, they'll call them, and so forth, which is probably true, by the way. But then you will arrange the sentences, which are just sort of little brief thoughts, and string them together in something you call a paragraph, which then you'll distinguish from another paragraph, and that the whole thing together will be the essay, right? That's how we're taught to write. That's not what we encounter in Francis Bacon. What he writes in is periods, and I'm going to explain the structure of the period for you. And maybe the best way to do it is to actually look at one of the essays. But as I say, they are arranged in terms of periods. And then the periods are connected together in a manner of clear thought. So let me come to Bacon here. Essays are counsel, civil, and moral. And I think the one I wanted you to read first was the one of truth. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the entirety of the essay. It's not that long. And then comment on how he uses the same types of syntactic devices to make his point. But I'll give it away a little bit here. The arrangement of the syntax is key to Bacon's style. And he saves the best point to last. And in general, he uses a tripartite comparison, and what we will call then climax. So he makes one point, and he makes a second point, and then the third point is the one that he's building up to. So he'll regularly make a threefold comparison, and the third of the three is the most important of the three. And you will see that, although it's not strictly the case, you can even find this in Hebrew writing. Although in general they use parallelism in Hebrew poetry as the stylistic feature. And I don't want to get off track with that right now and compare classical Greek and Roman rhetoric and poetic style to that of Hebrew. That's a subject unto itself, and I'll get off track if I talk about that too much. But let me just read this famous essay of truth, and then I will observe the Ciceronian aspects of the style, which are already breached right away when he begins with a sort of of what is truth. That's already breaking the style, so he's following Seneca rather than Cicero, but never mind. What is truth? Said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. Certainly there be that delight in giddiness, and there that delight in giddiness, and count it a bondage to fix a belief, affecting free will in thinking as well as in acting. And though the sects of philosophers of that kind, namely the skeptics, be gone, yet there remain certain discoursing wits which are of the same vein, though there be not so much blood in them as there was in those of the ancients. But it is not only the difficulty and labor which men take in finding out of truth, nor again that when it is found it imposes upon men's thoughts that doth bring lies in favor, but a natural though corrupt love of the lie itself. One of the later schools of the Grecians, examineth, I lost it when I went back to this, examineth the matter and is at a stand to think what should be in it, that men should love lies, where neither they make for pleasure, as with poets, nor for advantage, as with the merchant, but for the lie's sake. But I cannot tell. This same truth is a naked and open daylight, that doth not show the masks and mummeries and triumphs of the world half so stately and daintily as candlelights. A mixture of a lie doth ever add pleasure. Doth any man doubt that if there were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men poor shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition, and unpleasing to themselves? One of the fathers, the church fathers probably, in great severity called poesy vinum daemonum, the wine of devils, because it filleth the imagination, and yet it is but with the shadow of a lie. But it is not the lie that passeth through the mind, but the lie that sinketh in and settleth in it that doth the hurt, such as we spoke of before. But howsoever these things are thus in men's depraved judgments in affections. Yet truth, which only doth judge itself, teacheth that the inquiry of truth, which is the love-making or wooing of it, the knowledge of truth, which is the presence of it, and the belief of truth, which is the enjoying of it, is the sovereign good of human nature. Note the climax. 1, 2, 3. The first creature of God in the works of the days was the light of the sense. Let there be light. The last was the light of reason in the creation of Adam, the Logos. And his Sabbath work ever since is the illumination of his Spirit. First, he breathed light upon the face of the matter, or chaos. Then he breathed light into the face of man, and still he breatheth and inspireth light into the face of his chosen. The poet that beautified the sect that was otherwise inferior to the rest saith yet excellently well, it is a pleasure to stand upon the shore and to see ships tossed upon the sea, a pleasure to stand in the wind of a castle and to see a battle and the adventures thereof below, but no pleasure is comparable to the standing upon the vantage ground of truth, a hill not to be commanded, and where the air is always clear and serene, and to see the errors and wanderings and mists and tempests in the vale below. So always that this prospect be with pity and not with swelling or pride. Certainly it is heaven upon earth to have a man's mind move in charity, rest in providence, and turn upon the poles of truth. Poles of truth is the climax. To pass from theological and philosophical truth to the truth of civil business, it will be acknowledged even by those even by those that practice it not, that clear and round dealing is the honor of man's nature. And that mixture of falsehood is like alloy and coin of gold and silver, which may make the metal work the better, but it embaseth it. For these winding and crooked courses are the goings of the serpent, which goeth basely upon the belly and not upon the feet. There is no vice that doth so cover a man with shame as to be found false and perfidious. And therefore Montaigne saith prettily, when he inquired the reason why the word of the lie should be such a disgrace and such an odious charge, saith he, if it be well weighed, to say that a man lieth is as much to say that he is brave toward God and a coward towards men. For a lie faces God and shrinks from man. Surely the wickedness of falsehood and breach of faith cannot possibly be so highly expressed as in that it shall be the last peal to call the judgments of God upon the generations of men, it being foretold that when Christ cometh, he shall not find faith upon the earth. Conclusion. Now there's an essay. It's an essay on what? It's on truth, right? It's on the subject of truth. But note when he does it, he doesn't seek to define it. He begins with a question. The question to Pontius Pilate in the face of the one who is the truth. What is truth? And then leaves. Don't get an answer. This is the famous introduction to Bacon's essays. By the way, it's the 400th anniversary this year, 2025, of the completed version of Bacon's essays. He released some over the course of decades before that, but the finished work of Bacon's essays was published in 1625. It's a third edition. And this was the first of the essays that was produced in that edition. So I said I'd talk about the stylistic features of it, and I want to do that as well as just as the subject matter of truth per se. But note that when Bacon wants to talk about things, and this is characteristic of the 17th century, it's not satisfied with clarity and precision and removing all color. It doesn't want black and white. It wants the full-orbed picture. It wants the truth in its manifold nature. And it's willing to risk and even will include ideas of falsehood in it. Although not that it affirms the falsehood, but rather it thinks that you can't get rid of the falsehood. So it will include that in the whole picture of things, but it will use the light in order to expose the darkness in that as well. So there's a richness in this period, which we don't see in our age. When we hear people talk about the truth and falsehood, it becomes very mathematical and clear and precise. And it's shorn of all of its adornment. And here it's full of adornment. There's a lot of beauty as well as truth in the mix and the way he presents it. So what do we notice here? Well, we do have clarity, but we also have balance. We have the clear expression of very complicated ideas. And that balance of ideas is expressed through the arrangement of words and clauses. And the cumulative effect of it is persuasive. Not one point in itself. You can't take, or you could probably take Bacon's argument and put it in bullet points, but you would actually deprive it a lot of the force if you did so, because it's the weight of the whole argument that persuades. And I think that you can find the same structure in New Testament writing. So John's Gospel in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That goes on for, I realize in modern English it's punctuated with periods, full stops, broken down into sentences, but it's one extended period in this sense. It's an argument. Paul writes in a very Ciceronian style in that sense. Modern translators have to break it into periods, and when they do so, they deprive it of something of the force, the grand force of an argument that's been carrying on over the course of an entire page. There, we're not used to thinking that way. We're used to thinking in discrete little sentences that are broken down into atomistic ways, and we lose some of the sense of a long, extended thought. And that's just why people can't think in paragraphs anymore, let alone in pages, and they can't write novels, because we're taught to think in sentences, and short sentences at that, in which we have a subject, a verb, and an object. Mr. Bacon, on the other hand, is writing in with a periodic structure in which the last point of the period is the best point. It's the culmination of what he's been saying thus far. And he will use this threefold pattern repeatedly in this. So what is truth suggesting Pilate? Well, this is the introduction here. It doesn't really fit with what I'm saying about the Ciceronian structure, but it's interesting that he doesn't answer. And then that leads but that's just the entry point for Bacon then to consider this in the Ciceronian fashion that he does. So the main clause comes at the end of what we would call the sentence then. And often you will find that he will punctuate the parts of the period with semicolons, which we've largely lost the use of. I think, well, it's not a full stop. It is a full stop, but it's not as full and final as a period, as we call it, a full stop. Why do we use this then? Well, it's to structure clauses that are meant to be seen in parallel and comparatively. And the third of the three clauses then is the culmination of the argument that's been made thus far. So, for example, here, truth may come to the price of a pearl that showeth best by day. So here we go. Oops, I can't mark it like that. I could mark that there. Truth may perhaps come to the price of a pearl that showeth best by day, but it will not rise to the price of a diamond or a carbuncle. Well, a diamond's the most valuable, right? And a diamond looks good at night and in day. It's really interesting that Jesus talks about the pearl of precious price. Why does he use the pearl as an illustration? Why not a diamond? How come? People speculate on it, and who knows? Is it because a pearl is cultivated from a grain of sand inside of an oyster, and it cultivates and it grows over the course of time and becomes this beautiful thing. I mean, pearl's a precious thing. It's used for adornment, but so are jewels. Why doesn't he talk about a jewel of precious price? He specifically says a pearl. This will lead to all sorts of speculation amongst theologians and philosophers. Why exactly this particular? It's a valuable thing, yes, but why a pearl? Well, a pearl shows best by day in the light. Maybe that's why. Diamonds, if you go into a jewelry store, they will have it against a dark backdrop and they'll have glaring bright light on it to show its brilliance, right? And you almost need the black backdrop to get that full sense of it. But diamonds look good also not in the, they don't have to be in the full light. You can see them and their beauty in the twilight, as it were. But a pearl, you need the light. So says Bacon. Well, why? Because when you look at a pearl, you see some of the rainbow in it even. Right? So there's a coloration in it. It's not just that. Anyway, but be as it may, that's his point here. Truth may perhaps come to the price of a pearl that showeth best by day, but it will not rise to the price of that, even though they're more valuable. In very lights, a mixture of a lie doth ever add pleasure, which is why people embellish their stories. Some people are really good at this, right? So the story of something that events happen, and then it becomes funnier if you make the people that are talking wittier than they normally would be, and you end up saying the line that you wish that you'd said after the fact, because it occurred to you after, oh, I wish I'd said that. Well, when you retell the tale, you did say that, because the purpose of the story is to get people to laugh. You're not really interested in the lie per se, but you're interested in telling a funny story and making it even funnier, and you do that by embellishing, in other words, by lying. It adds pleasure. Doth any man doubt that if there were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men poor, shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition and unpleasing to themselves. So he talks, note that he is not praising lying, but he is saying there's a certain richness that comes from what we will call the imagination, making things up. And is it the purpose of making things up to lie? No, it's not. That's not the purpose. It doesn't begin that way. It begins there for, as I say, the purpose of giving delight. That's the one way, and then he reflects on ancient views of this. As I say, Plato condemns the poets, wants to throw them out of the Republic for telling falsehoods. Augustine calls the poesy the wine of the devil, because again, it's not fully truthful. But it is not the lie that passes through the mind, but so here's his response to Augustine and Plato. It's not the lie that passes through your mind, but the lie that sinks in and settles in it that hurts you. When you accept it as truth, in other words. Which is what my children always say to me when I say we shouldn't watch this, because it's, misrepresenting things. And they said, Dad, we can tell that it's not real. Why do you keep interrupting it? Of course it's not real. We know that. You don't need to remind us of it, so it's because it's obvious. In other words, the falsehoods pass through the minds, and it's a legitimate concern of any educator, any parent, that their children not be believing the wrong things. But I think when you are repeatedly subjected to lies, the plausibility of the lie becomes more apparent over the course of time. So I think there is some merit in the concern at any rate. But howsoever these things are, thus a man's depraved judgments and affections. And here's the point, and why I wanted to highlight it here. Yet truth, which only doth judge itself, teaches that the inquiry of truth, so there's point one, the inquiry of truth, which is the lovemaking or wooing of it. So the knowledge or the desire for knowing is a sort of love. It's an intellectual love for the truth. We're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Loving God with our minds. And that's like a lovemaking. It's wooing. Trying to make the truth our partner, our spouse. So the inquiry, point one, the knowledge of the truth, which is the presence of it, and the belief of truth. So there's the three phases: inquiry, knowledge of, and belief of, which is the enjoying of it, is the sovereign good of human nature. The third is the sovereign good of human nature. Actually all three, but only when you have the belief in it, which is the enjoyment of it, because you believe it when you take delight in it. It's not just when you say, this is what I believe, but if you don't actually enjoy what is true, then you don't actually believe it. You should take delight in it. You should want to defend it because it's your beloved. Right? That it's not enough to hold to it in a cold, distant fashion, which is the model of empirical inquiry. I can open this to criticism. I think in principle you can always question truth in that sense. But in general, you're so committed, wedded to the truth that you're going to regard the questioning of it with a bit of defensiveness of your beloved from attack. Right? There's that aspect to it. It's very well put on Mr. Bacon's part. But note that the third of this is the greatest of these things. So there is this feature of Ciceronian eloquence, I think, which regularly employs the climax. The word climax is the Greek word for a ladder. So you go up one rung to the next rung to the highest rung. And the threefold nature of it is regular. You don't have to have three, you could even add four. But normally it's three. And he's gonna develop that in what so he first talks about, again, inquiry of truth, knowledge of truth, belief of truth. Those are three. Now he goes on to a second three. The first creature of God in the works of the days was the light of the sense. Right? Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light. And there was light, and there was evening and morning the first day. Right? It says, let there be light. First creature of God is not what we would call as a creature, but rather the light. No, it's even before the sun and the moon, by the way, which is also interesting. But the light is the first, and that was the light of the sense. Okay, that's a type of light. The light of the sense. The last was the light of reason. Why the light of reason being the last? Because on the sixth day, God created man in his own image. And what Bacon implies here, which he expects us to understand, which I need to amplify because everyone's forgotten this truth. The definition of a human person that all Christians understand from Boethius onward up until the Enlightenment period when we suddenly forget this, or rather it gets distorted in a different direction, as that a human person is an individual substance of a rational nature. That's Boethius's definition, 5th century Christian philosopher. A person is an individual substance of a rational nature. In other words, here, that being created on the sixth day has the light of reason. The light that lighteth every man that cometh in the world is the capacity for reason. That's what so there's two different types of light. There's the light that lights up everything that we can see, and then there's the inner light of reasoning. But that's not the most important one. On his Sabbath work, in which he rests, ever since, is the illumination of his Spirit. Gift of the Holy Spirit, which allows us to, is like the floodlight that shows Christ, allows us to apprehend Christ as our Savior. Poureth out on the church on the day of Pentecost. Turns the disciples who had abandoned Christ into those that will die rather than renounce their faith. Peter will deny him 3 times. After Pentecost, he will refuse to disavow his Lord. What's the difference? The Holy Spirit. God in him, staying in him. Christ is gone. He's given the comfort of the Holy Spirit. And now he's a different man. And so are all the disciples. He taught them for 3 years. He taught them with the light of reason. reasoning with them in the scriptures. And now he's given them another form of illumination, but it's the illumination of the Holy Spirit. So the Oxford motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my light and my salvation. It's the center of the university in that sense. So first he breathed light upon the face. So this is one type of light. Then there's light in the face of man, that is reason. And finally, the light that is in the face of his chosen. So his chosen are those that have the Holy Spirit. That's not the whole of the human race, but the most important light of all. Right? So it all culminates in the climactic, the face of his chosen. The poet that beautified the sect that was otherwise inferior to the rest saith yet excellently well. And now we get again another threefold comparison. It's a pleasure to stand upon the shore, to see ships tossed upon the sea. Semicolon. A pleasure to stand in the window of a castle and to see a battle in the adventures thereof below. Colon. But no pleasure is comparable to the standing upon the vantage ground of truth. So now we have, in the third, we have a contrast with the two that we're foregoing. But it's still a threefold comparison. But in the third, there's a twist against the other. But no pleasure, and yet it's still is comparable to that. A hill not to be commanded, and where the air is always clear and serene, and to see the errors and wanderings and mists and tempests in the vale below. That is the greatest pleasure of all. And now remember, he's talking about truth. And now he's marrying it with delight. The greatest pleasure of all is to see the errors of the human race set before you, below you. This is a hill you don't command. It's a hill that belongs to the Lord. You happen to be on it, but you don't own it. You don't regulate it. So always that this prospect be with pity and not with swelling or pride. There's the key point. You may say that we have the truth, but it's not our truth, it's his truth. We stand upon that hill, but we don't command the hill. He's the commander of the hill. It's the city of God. It's the mountain of God, the mountain of the Lord. To pass from theological and philosophical truth to the truth of the civil business. Okay, so the third. Now this is really interesting. He's talked about the beginning. He's talked about theological truth. He began with Pontius Pilate, what is truth? And then he's talked about it philosophically speaking. And now he moves to a third way of looking at the truth, which is in terms of practical human affairs. This is very much of a Reformation emphasis. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all of these vocations can be done for the glory of God and should be done for the glory of God, and can be informed by scriptures so that you do divine work, even in what is, from the vantage of the classical age, a menial task. To the truth of civil business, it will be acknowledged even by those that practice it not, that clear and round dealing is the honor of man's nature. So being a man who keeps his word, doesn't lie, doesn't cheat, gives what he owes, does the day's labor that he promised, is the honor of man's nature. And that mixture of falsehood is like allay and coin of gold and silver. Well, he's already made that comparison, which may make the metal work the better, but it embaseth it. So you can lie to your employer. You can steal from your employer. You can work less hard. You can say, I got paid for this day's work and I punched out at the same time as everybody else, but did you give a full day's work? No, because you embaseth it with other things and yourself in the process, and the work, because the work that you do is for the Lord. And now it's not for the Lord. You're actually doing it for yourself. It's self-absorbed, self-centered in that sense. For these, and now he makes the comparison again, going back theologically, for these winding and crooked courses are the goings of the serpent, which goeth basely upon the belly and not upon the feet. There is no vice that doth so cover a man with shame as to be found false and perfidious. Isn't that interesting? This is a Western cultural assertion. It's a Christian assertion, but it will belong to the Greco-Roman world as well. To be accused of falsehood is a heinous charge for us. How come? Because God is the truth. And his ways should be our ways. And let your yes be yes and your no be no, and so forth. You can't have a profitable economic world unless people are honest in how much they contribute and how much work they've done. Have you really done your utmost here? Or are you living off the labor of other people? Do you really want what you're owed? Because there's a judge there that will determine all that. And therefore Montaigne saith prettily, when he inquired the reason why the word of the lie should be such a disgrace and such an odious charge, saith, if it be well weighed to say that a man lieth, it is as much to say that he is brave towards God and a coward towards men. Well, he's echoing Erasmus there in this. That's what a liar is. He's brave towards, or he's rather a coward toward men, but brave towards God. In other words, he's an atheist. Because he's going to be caught out in the lie. God sees all things. But he's afraid of men's opinions, so he's willing to lie. But here's Bacon pushing on the importance of veracity in conjunction with being a Christian and divine character in this. For a lie faces God and shrinks from man. Surely the wickedness of falsehood and breach of faith cannot possibly be so highly expressed as in that it shall be the last peal to call the judgments of God upon the generations of men, it being foretold that when Christ cometh, he shall not find faith upon the earth. He puts it as a rhetorical, Jesus does, by the way. Will he find? Rather than that he will, I think. But maybe not. As things get more and more wicked, they become more and more marked by falsehood. They allay, just like in the rings of Lord of the Rings. I don't know how much you know Lord of the Rings, but Celeborn, when he's forging the rings of power for the dwarves and the elves and so forth, they mix it with mithril. But he also lies to Gil-galad, the chief elf, about what's going on. And that is part of the undoing and the work of Sauron in trying to subdue all Middle Earth to the one ring of power, is that he forges it using falsehood. It's Tolkien's way of engaging with the same topic. Integrity and artistry and so forth. What do you think? So note that there are all sorts of rhetorical devices. So he begins with a rhetorical question. We see the parallel structures throughout of it. I emphasize those. And part of them are to make the whole essay memorable and rich. And he's building. At the end of it, you're persuaded by the argument, by the force of the argument. Not just the truth of it, but the force of it. So there's rhetorical power to this. I found that contemporary apologetics is very deficient in this. That is, in making forceful arguments. They don't move. They persuade the minds, but they don't move the hearts. You move the hearts by doing what Mr. Bacon has done. And you should do that. Note that his sentences also vary in length, but the periodic structure, the tripartite nature, and saving the most significant point to the third of them is also characteristic of the periodic type of structuring. Now, you can do this, I think, in your own writing. But that's not what you're taught in school. You're taught subject, verb, object, keep it short, keep it clear, don't use excessive adornment. He doesn't use it. There's no word in here which you could remove from this. It's not that he's added anything that you could take away. But he has illustrated it by differing types of comparisons. And the ones that he uses at the end related back to the ones he used right at the beginning. There was an integrity throughout the entirety. So it was a forceful argument about truth. And yet he thought about it from various sides. Pilate wasn't even interested in the answer. Jesus says at the end, in his concluding thought, he will find no faith upon the earth, as in trust and love of the truth. Because he defined faith earlier, right? The faith is those that love the truth and enjoy it as the sovereign good of human nature, and will defend it as such. Any comments or questions? Observations? How do you like Mr. Bacon? He's one of the great writers in the English language. By the way, the Ciceronian technique and style will be followed by Mr. Milton in this same period. And you will find that it will influence orators throughout the ages all the way to Winston Churchill. Churchill will use the same Ciceronian style, which if I were doing a course on rhetoric, I could show you that orators continue to use this. Abraham Lincoln uses this. Barack Obama will use this. Any orator worth his salt will use a Ciceronian form of persuasion because it's the cumulative force of argumentation. He has to grab you right at the beginning, just like Bacon does. And he comes up with an idea that appeals. It appeals intellectually, but it also, you recognize it. Note that his appeal is to the veracity said by his forebears. He's acknowledging and citing them. He's citing the skeptics. He's citing the Stoics. He's citing the Epicureans. There are different schools of philosophy. He's citing Scripture as the authority of all authorities, for that matter. And yet, it's the force of the whole thing that makes persuasion, not any individual point. They're all amplifying the same thing. So that's what I'm talking about, the adornment, which is characteristic of this period, which I think the Christian world has lost, by and large. C.S. Lewis had it. How come? Because he read people that used the same style, and he imitated it. I mentioned Lewis just simply because he's for evangelicals, he's the best known Christian writer, perhaps. But citing authorities is a precedent of ancient oratory, which Bacon follows. And it needs to appeal to your lived sensibilities as well as your ideas. So it appeals to like pearls, like common day experiences. Jesus teaches the same way, right? He uses the imagery of country life. But there's more being said than, it's not just a random illustration. Like I was at McDonald's the other day. It doesn't really have quite the same force, even though it's a practical experience. This one's grounded in the nature of the world, which McDonald's really isn't. Not to go too hard at McDonald's. Comments, questions? Anything? I'll leave it for a second. Okay. Stop.